And welcome back as we go ahead and now look at functions that use parameters in Python. So functions that use parameters are sometimes known as function arguments. So these, of course, are just information that we can pass into functions, and in Python these are referred to as arguments. This is much more interchangeable to think about with our term parameters that we might be more familiar with if we're coming from a Java-based background. Arguments are, of course, specified after the function name inside parentheses. And you can add as many arguments as you want to a function, just separate them with a comma. So, for example, if we have a single argument, I might have definition, my function, fname, print your first name is fname. And then, of course, just in the function call, you would just say my function, and in the parentheses, you just put whatever that you want to pass, in this case, Emily. And if we were to run this example function here, it would just print out your first name is Emily. Now, again, as we talk about the number of arguments, by default, a function must be called with the correct number of arguments. That means if your function expects 2 arguments, you have to call that function with 2 arguments. So in this version of my function, you can see we pass in 2 different arguments. We have fname and lname, so first name and last name. And in the my function call, you can see it says Emily, comma, Rose. So it's going to pass in first name plus last name as Emily plus Rose. And so, again, you need to have that match. If you just try to put in just Emily and is looking for the other one, you're going to get an error. Now, of course, one of the things that we need to talk about is returning values. So if you want a function to return a value, rather than have it, let's say, do all your calculations and stuff within that function, then maybe you want to take that value and pass it to another function, then we're going to use the return statement. So, for example, definition, my function x, return 5 times x. Print, my function 3. What is this one going to do? Well, that means we're going to pass in the value 3. It's going to return 5 times x, so that's going to be 5 times 3, which means it would then return the value of 15. So that, of course, is then being printed. So then we would have the number 15 up here. Now, of course, we can't talk about functions without, of course, talking about our friend recursion. Python does accept function recursion, which means, of course, as we are familiar with, that a defined function can call itself. Now, while we won't be looking at how recursion is used in this lesson, know that it does exist. And if you do ultimately end up deciding, hey, I do want to have a recursive function in my code, hey, here's 2 things to keep in mind. You should always, of course, be careful with recursion, as we know, because it can lead to a function that either doesn't terminate because it's just going to keep building stacks until you run out of memory, or it's going to use that excess amounts of memory or processing power in order to complete that function. However, as we know, recursion, when it's used correctly, can be very, very efficient to developing good algorithms. Now on over to Visual Studio Code. Let's go ahead and take a look at one of these functions with parameters here. So in here, I have my main function here, and I'm simply going to have it pass in 2 predefined values. And I'm going to use that same function, but now I'm going to pass in user-defined values. And so here's my function. It's just a very simple one. It's just going to sum, and it's adding 2 numbers. And so it's going to print out adding the 2 numbers, and it's going to do total, num1 plus num2, and return that total to be printed. So we go ahead and run this. It says adding the 2 numbers. So my predefined function had the values 1 and 2. And so when it does that, it's going to add 1 plus 2, put in total, returns total. And remember, you notice here that total is a variable that only exists here. It is not, of course, necessarily global in scope. It's not an instance. It's simply just restricted to this local block of code. And it allows it to be executed just fine because we return that value for this print statement to use here in our main function. Then we, of course, can enter 2 numbers. So let's say we do 5 and let's do 7. All right, so now it's going to pass in 5 and 7, so we get 12, because if you look at how our function is called here, it says sum, value 1 plus value 2. These are 2 variables that have been defined from user input, so those end up being our arguments here, or our parameters, if we are more familiar with that terminology. And so those 2 parameters are now in here, and that allows it to then do 7 and 5 added together, so we get 12. Again, a very simple approach. It's nothing too unfamiliar for what we might be expecting. Again, the biggest thing is just to make sure that when we start calling these functions, that we do so appropriately. Now, you notice I had down here, my main function is the only function I call on the outside. Where did I call the sum function? Because you notice it's not here. You notice, again, the sum function is being called here inside of my main. Just a nice way to kind of clean that up, to keep my code a little bit more segmented to different approaches so I can use that appropriately. Again, this is a function calling a function, which is perfectly fine that you can use, but this should give us now a good foundational understanding of how to use both functions with and without parameters that we can use in our Python programming.